So this is a re-upload. The original video got taken down like 12 hours after it was put up because of apparently violent or graphic content. And I didn't know what they thought was violent or graphic content, so I'm just gonna put some drone footage of Moscow over most of this video. So here you go. I was on Twitter the morning after the shooting in New Zealand, my time, and I saw this tweet by this verified Arabic account, and it said, "He's a terrorist, not mentally ill. He's a terrorist, nothing else." And to it I replied, "Are you saying that he can't be both?" That got me thinking about a few years ago, like 2014 to 2016. Every time a white kid acted out one of those big mass shootings from that time period, I'd see liberals and people I knew on Facebook talking about how when he's white, you call him mentally ill, but when he's brown or Muslim, you call him a terrorist. Why don't you call white people terrorists? And I'd usually respond with how that specific shooter wasn't a terrorist because he didn't have an ideological motive and how he actually was mentally ill. And I had to explain this shit every time, but they just never got it. I thought about it a bit more, and I realized that it really felt like it was every time, though. That if some mass shooter was white, he would actually be mentally ill and seem to have no ideological motive. But if the perpetrator was Muslim, they found no signs of mental illness and were just some wacky extremist. And it just clicked. Omar Mateen, the Pulse nightclub shooter, showed no signs of mental illness. And remember, he was raised in a stable household by a, quote, all-American and, quote, moderate Muslim parents. This guy was raised in a moderate Muslim, all-American family. You know, this is what these Muslim parents and families and immigrants should strive to be, just like that family. Now, of course, one of them ended up becoming a terrorist. Micah Xavier Johnson, the man who killed 6 and injured 11 Dallas police in 2016, experienced his parents' divorce as a child and showed anger management issues later in life, likely as a result of that, but no serious mental health issues. Remember also that a fatherless childhood is the statistical norm for African Americans, so how much of a factor we can consider that is uncertain. Going for Europe now, because there has been many attacks by non-whites in the USA. Anis Amri, the Berlin Christmas market truck driver, no evidence of mental illness. Fuck, I'm gonna butcher this. Sharif and Saeed Kouachi, the Charlie Hebdo shooters, were orphaned at a young age and lived in foster care, but I saw nothing about mental illness for these two either. When I point out that white Muslims don't commit terrorist attacks like Arab Muslims do, I usually hear the response, "What white Muslims? There aren't any white Muslims." And I guess that most people just don't know that Bosnia, Albania, Chechnya, and Kosovo exist. Actually, Kosovo doesn't exist, but most people think it does. I'm sure there's a distinctive reason why the fact that there are countries in Europe with Muslim majorities has been kept from the public knowledge is beyond me, but I'll get to the bottom to it. So I had the Beslan massacre pointed out to me by my mom. The Beslan massacre was, let's face it, a military decision. The Beslan massacre is highly organized, it was highly pre-planned out, and in a period between two wars. The purpose of the Beslan massacre was to cause fear for the new de facto independent Chechnya and demand recognition. It was not the same as Mateen wanting to go shoot up a nightclub, just to shoot up a nightclub in the name of Allah. Now let's look at it on a more national scale, shall we? Albania used to be majority Muslim, now it's split 3 ways between Orthodox, Christian, Catholic, and Muslim. No terrorist problem. Bosnia, no terrorist problem. Not anymore, at least. Kosovo, there are some conflicts and incidents, but remember that area has been in flux and ethnic conflict since the 90s. And there is the overarching context of ethnic conflict. All of the terrorist attacks committed by white Muslims are in wartime and or under the context of ethnic conflict. Even when white Muslims do commit these terrorist attacks, remember that they're doing them in wartime. The Beslan massacre was a wartime decision in order to strike fear into the Russians. And you got to admit, when a Bosnian burned down a Serbian house during the Bosnian War, that's a little bit less unexcusable than shooting up a nightclub just to shoot up a nightclub. It's just not the same. Even white Muslims, they are generally peaceful outside of wartime. Shitlibs love to say that all mass shooters are white, so fine. Let's give them that. It's not even true, but let's give them that. Of the 27 deadliest mass shooters in the USA before 2019, 26 of them were not raised by their biological father since childhood. And guess who was the one? Who was the one out of the 27 that was raised by his biological father? Omar Mateen. The one out of 27 was an Arab Muslim with no mental health issues. According to the LA Times, quote, at least 59% of all the 185 public mass shootings, which means at least 4 people were killed in 24 hours, that took place in the United States from 1900 through 2017 were carried out by people who had either been diagnosed with mental disorder or demonstrated signs of serious mental illness prior to the attack. Remember though that, quote, mass shooting, end quote, just means that at least 4 people were killed in a 24-hour period. All the big shooters, you remember there were white guys, Sandy Hook, Aurora, Parkland. These guys were mentally ill on top of having fatherless childhoods. Now I should add, James Holmes, the Aurora shooter, actually converted to Islam in prison after doing what he did. Just think about this for a second. So in order to commit these horrendous acts, I won't call them terrorist attacks because aside from the New Zealand one, they weren't terrorist attacks. They had no ideological motive. White men have to have fucked up childhoods and be mentally ill. White Muslims have to be in the middle of a seriously deadly ethnic conflict. But Arabs only need to be Muslim in order to commit acts of terrorism. Not even radical Muslims, as we saw from Omar Mateen. And never mind that, quote, radical Muslims make up a majority of the Muslim population around the globe. That's just for another time. What does this tell you about whites in comparison to other races? When whites have to be mentally diseased and be raised in fatherless households, but non-whites only need to be Muslim. Whites need to be more than just Muslim in order to commit terrorism. You hear the trope about, now the white men are the biggest terrorist threat to America. Haha, checkmate conservatards. Who's really the threat to the West? Which group only needs to be told to kill by a book? Which group needs to have all kinds of psychological issues in order to even consider something like that? And the left loves to remind us of the context, or at least they used to. They used to love to remind us to think about the context whenever a Muslim attack happens. So let's look at the context of the New Zealand shooting. In a zero migration scenario, if literally not a single Muslim was allowed onto the continent ever again, France would be 12.7% Muslim by 2050. In a high migration scenario, which is pretty similar to what Europe is going through now, Europe would be over 14% Muslim by 2050, with the Muslim population concentrated almost entirely in Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, and Western Northern Europe. France would be 18% Muslim, Germany 19.7%, Austria 19.9%, and Sweden 30.6%. The United States is set to be minority white by 2045. In 1960, America was 85% white. So in a span of 75 years, the United States white population will go from being 85% to less than half of its own country's population. I've seen people share screenshots of the graph or like screenshots of a tweet that shows the graph from Wikipedia, like the religion percentage graph from Wikipedia, showing Muslims being only 1.8% of the population in New Zealand, to be like, look at how small the Muslim population is. White nationalists are just a bunch of bigots that get worked up over nothing. One, it was never about New Zealand. The guy in his manifesto put a much bigger emphasis on Western Europe and the USA than New Zealand. 2, the guy was from Australia anyways. 3, the statistic was from 2013, the same year that the Syrian refugee crisis started, so we can assume that this population is much larger now. 4, 3/4 of all Muslims in New Zealand in 2013 were foreign born, so the Muslim population was probably only about a quarter of the size a decade or two before 2013, and even less now in comparison, with the likely increase due to instability in the Middle East. Whites do not want to become ethnic nor religious minorities in their own countries. Whites, the more racial anxiety increases, will lash out against people that they rightfully see as part of an invading group of people. Andrew Yang, whom the rights have flooded to, gets this, though he doesn't see the full conclusion of this idea that racial conflict largely exists due to them occupying the same area.
And so there's a very happy notion in some quarters that the country will just become more tolerant as it gets more diverse. You just figure that math will take care of it, because if you have enough people, everyone will just have to get along. Unfortunately, that is not really the way things play out if you look at historical examples. There are very, very few examples in human history of a dominant racial or ethnic group giving up its dominance over time. That actually is not normal. That's not normal behavior. And so if you look at what's happening right now in this country, you can see an increasingly insecure white majority becoming more and more hostile, truly. And who is going to be the boogeyman of the next 10 to 20 years? Who's going to be the great rival to the United States in the eyes of American society? China, that's right. And so what do you think the attitude is going to be over time for the shrinking, insecure white majority that's losing their jobs for, let's say, Chinese Americans or Asian Americans? I personally said to a group at Harvard, I think we're one generation away from falling into the same camps as the Jews who were attacked in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, just a couple months ago. It's like we're probably one generation away from Americans shooting up a bunch of Asians saying, damn the Chinese because there's a giant Cold War or even more with China. That is the great danger that I fear that my children are going to grow up in.
I didn't even have this originally in my video, but this just played right in my head. I mentioned earlier how when white Muslims commit acts of terrorism, they're almost always under the context of ethnic conflict. Well, what's going on now in the West? The West is experiencing an ever-increasing ethnic conflict between the native whites and whom they believe to be an invading force. Brenton Tarrant seemed to be completely mentally stable. His manifesto was ripe with painfully self-aware satire, but justified his heinous acts with the context of ethnic conflict. You will not stop whites from wanting to keep their places to themselves. You're not going to. These kind of outbursts are the direct results of policies by politicians in Western countries that think it's going to be all kumbaya and tolerant the more they're letting people different from them. Usually the right plays defense on these things, but not anymore. Not for this one. And I'm proud of them for that. The finger is pointed directly at politicians like Angela Merkel and Jacinda Ardern, who, by the way, just announced that the gun laws in New Zealand will change. So not only is she ignoring the real problem, but also going after a non-existent one. White men are not going to sit idly by while this goes on. I condemn the acts of the shooter. Terrorism and starting a race war is not the solution to the problem. However, white men are sick of this crap. They're sick of being an increasingly foreign environment. Just stop trying to shove this multiculturalist BS down the throat of Westerners. We don't want it.